From the Gert Boyle studio at OPB, this is Think Out Loud. I'm Dave Miller. Oregonians overwhelmingly voted against Measure 120 this week. Known as the gas tax, the measure would have increased the state's gas tax by 6 cents a gallon, temporarily hiked the payroll tax, and doubled fees for registrations and titles. It was referred to voters after Democratic lawmakers passed a bill meant to address funding shortfalls for the Oregon Department of Transportation. But without this new revenue, the agency only has funding to support core services through 2027. Daniel Porter is ODOT's Finance and Budget Division Administrator. He joins us now to talk about the path forward. It's great to have you on Think Out Loud.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
I gave the short version of this, but how would Measure 120 have raised revenue?
That's right. In your short version, it was very accurate, right? We would have had essentially a 6 cent increase in the fuels tax, which is currently 40 cents per gallon. It would have increased to 46 cents per gallon. And then increases in light vehicle registration fees and title fees, as well as sort of a doubling of the payroll tax for transit that was sunsetted right to the end of 2027. So those are the kind of the core elements of 3991 that were referred to the voters. It would have probably raised overall maybe 300-ish million a year in additional revenue that would then split between ODOT and cities and counties.
What would that money have then been spent on?
That's a great question. It really, the idea behind this was for ODOT, it was to provide funding for core sort of maintenance and operations functions. So ODOT has a very complicated set of revenue streams that most of the new revenue from prior sort of transportation packages, whether starting in 2001 all the way through 2017, have been really dedicated to projects, not into sort of the maintenance and operations functions. So that hasn't seen really an increase since like 1993, which is also, interestingly enough, the last time the federal gas tax was increased. And so without those increases, costs have been rising over time. We haven't had a lot of new revenue. And so this money was going to really support those core functions so that we're able to sort of maintain service levels that we have today.
What would Measure 120 have meant for public transit?
It would have been a huge influx of revenue for public transit. Like it's basically doubling of the payroll tax. So what that would have meant it's again almost think of it as like a doubling amount of revenue that would be available for public transit. Although it was short term, so it would be interesting to have seen how transit agencies, transit districts would have had to kind of deal with that, knowing that there's a sort of a sunset on it. But it would have been a really large influx of revenue and help to the transit districts.
How do you explain the fact that more than 8 out of 10 Oregon voters said no to this measure? It's just an electoral bloodbath.
Right. And I think that's actually probably really similar to the fuels tax that was referred to the voters, I think was it 2001 or 2000, right around there, where the last time sort of the gas tax was referred to the voters. Timing's terrible, right, with the fuel prices being so high. And it's also something that, as an agency, we were building in the expectation that revenue wasn't going to show up. So we as an agency have to build our budgets based on what we call current law, which is basically like taking what we know to be true. And at the time, right, those are taxes and fees that are on hold until the voters would approve them. They aren't true and they aren't in law. And so we were kind of building our next budget cycle based on the fact that they weren't going to happen. So that the agency is sort of already building our expectations around that it wasn't going to happen. The increases weren't going to take effect.
Right. For the current biennium that we're now almost halfway through, right? That goes through the end of June 2027. Is my calendar math right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. So I want to turn soon to the questions of the path forward, but I'm just still curious about your read on this vote. One read, you mentioned the gas prices now, the war in Iran, for example, jacking up gas prices. And so one read is that Oregonians just said, no, we don't want to pay more at the pump. Another read that I've heard is that Oregonians are wary of entrusting your agency with more money. What do you say to Oregonians who don't trust the agency right now to be good stewards of public money?
Yeah, that's appreciate that, Dave. And I think that those were pieces of 3991 that weren't referred to the voters. You know, and the bill was a lot broader than just these tax increases. And I think that during the 25 legislative session, there was a lot of conversation about ODOT accountability and transparency. And they had developed some measures and some ways of which to to bring that out, you know, whether it's through more audits or just being able to, or being more transparent in our information that we're providing. Like those elements stayed and are in place today. And so I think the agencies are really committed to being as transparent as possible, to providing information that is needed to help make decisions for the legislature, for the governor's office, for the public, and we want to be providing services that are desired and that are needed and are committed to do so. So we're happy and look forward to kind of what these changes can be and what more things could come along during like maybe 27th session to help ensure that the public is feeling confident that this is an agency they can trust.
You had been facing a $300 million shortfall for the current budget cycle. What did lawmakers do in the most recent session to address that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because I think a lot of it is that ODOT couldn't do things themselves, right? We needed the legislature to act in order to be able to maybe move money around or something, right? And so what they did during 26 sessions or our short session we just ended was they took some one-time reductions within the agency, but then they did what they call revenue redirections, right? Which is like moving money from certain funds to other funds in order to basically shift revenue around into our maintenance and operations functions in order to close our budget gap for our current budget period that we're in now, like you said, which ends June of 2027.
So, and as you said, you when you were making your plans for this current biennium, the assumption was that these revenue raising pieces, the gas tax, registration fees, title fees, that those would not be approved by voters. So, does this vote have any effect on your programs or your budget for the next 14 months?
Is the vote today or the vote on Tuesday, right, is not going to impact the current biennium. I think that's when the legislature made the decisions they made during the short session to provide funding for the agency the expectation behind that was that we would be providing services to Oregonians at the level that support those funding. So we've been hiring and filling positions that are vacant, especially with critical positions, in order to kind of continue to provide service levels, and we will continue to do that throughout the remainder of the biennium, as sort of what we were directed by the legislature and the governor's office to do.
The governor has convened a new bipartisan working group made up of lawmakers and experts and stakeholders and some business folks, advocates, various folks that they met at the beginning of this month already. But the underlying fundamentals of the fiscal challenges the agency is facing, those haven't changed. There are only so many ways to raise revenue for transportation. What can this new work group possibly come up with that has not already been put forward in recent years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the hope, right, is that there will be something interesting coming out of that work group. It's a different work group than what we had a couple of years ago. it's set up differently. I think it involves a lot of different parties, and like you said, they just had a kickoff meeting like earlier this month, and the subgroups that they've set up to kind of look at these specific topic areas, they haven't even started to meet yet. But I think that's what they're trying to do is just like look at all the different needs, understand that there's only so much potential funding to even go around. So think about like what are the priorities, what do we want to look at, potentially funding, what are maybe the different options, right, that are available, and then sort of package all that and to present it to the governor and the legislature as a way to help kind of kickstart a 27 conversation.
But do you see this as a way, and you're not a political analyst, I recognize that, but I'm going to ask you this anyway. Do you see this more as a way to build political capital and to get people who have been wary of giving ODOT more money, just a way to get them on board, or a way to come up with something completely new that has not already been discussed?
Yeah, like you said, I'm not a political analyst, but I think from our perspective, and I've been around a long time. I've been doing this a long time. It would be the latter. I think is of what you said is what I think what we're looking for is what transportation is a system, right? And it is something that impacts every Oregonian all across the state, whether you're a direct user of it or everybody's a beneficiary of it. And so how do we bring people together, uh, develop some sort of common understanding that this system is, and it's a system of layers, right? ODOT's just one layer of it. If local governments are equally as stressed as ODOT is in terms of funding, and how we pull all that together and then sort of solve for something that everybody can get behind. And I think that's the big question, and that's what we're trying to try to solve for. And it is like it's a challenge, but we need to do it, and otherwise we'll be continually back here having this conversation again.
Is there any way to solve for that without saying somehow Oregonians, you're going to have to pay more?
Well, you saw in the 26th session what the legislature did they did some reductions and then they did some revenue redirection. So I think there is a an element there that could be a combination of things. But the underlying problem doesn't change, right? Which is our revenue streams are not growing as fast as our costs are growing, and our costs have been rising a lot faster. And until like sort of solve for something long term like that, like we're gonna have continuing to have issues around with our budget because it's not what we have right now isn't sustainable in the long run.
Daniel Porter, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Dave.
Daniel Porter is a Finance and Budget Division Administrator for the Oregon Department of Transportation.